June 4th, 1942. 10 to 26, North Pacific, 240 miles northwest of Midway. The sea is a sheet of hammered steel under a pale sky, and Akagi's flight deck is a workshop of noise. Men run bent forward against the wind, boots slapping planks. A deck crewman drags a fuel hose that snakes like a living thing, and the stench of avia gasoline clings to everything, sweet and poisonous. Below the deck, in the hangars, aircraft sit packed wingtip to wingtip. Bombs and torpedoes are stacked in neat rows like heavy coins, their metal casings cold in the dim light. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands near the island structure, his binoculars hanging unused, his face set in the hard calm of a man who has trained himself never to show doubt. Beside him, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, his chief of staff, watches the sky and watches the deck, counting minutes, counting risks. The morning has already been a knife fight. Midway has not died quietly. Nagumo has turned his carriers again and again, launching strikes, recovering planes, rearming, shifting ordnance in the belly of the ship. Every decision has been made with the speed of a hammer blow. Every decision has also been made with incomplete information. Then the lookout's voice cuts through the wind. Not another Midway raid, not another torpedo run. This is something else. High above, tiny glints appear, falling out of the sun for a heartbeat. Nobody moves. The flight deck crew is trained to obey signals and routines, not nightmares. The glints grow into shapes, and the shapes become aircraft with straight wings and dive brakes. American dive bombers, SBD Dauntless. They are coming down almost vertically, engines screaming, wings shuddering. You can feel it before the first bomb hits. The ship seems to tense underfoot. Men point, men freeze. A signalman waves frantically. Too late to matter. Somewhere below, in the hangar, a mechanic looks up at the steel ceiling and hears a rising roar like a train in a tunnel. The first explosion is not a clean blast. It is a tearing, ripping violence that punches through wood and steel and turns air into fire. A column of black smoke erupts from the deck. A second bomb detonates among aircraft being fueled and armed. Gasoline becomes a weapon. The shock wave flings men as if they are dolls, and the deck instantly changes from a working surface into a burning landscape. Nagumo's world narrows to flashes and fragments. The deck is suddenly impossible to cross. Heat rolls in waves. A plane's wing is on fire, dripping molten paint. Ammunition pops like insects. Down in the hangar, flames race along fuel lines and crawl into the ordnance stacks. Torpedoes begin to cook, their warheads ticking toward catastrophe. Kusaka shouts for damage reports, but reports are drowned by alarms and by the crackle of fire. A runner arrives with blood on his sleeve and says words that cannot be unsaid. The hangar is burning out of control. Aircraft cannot be launched. Aircraft cannot be recovered. The ship's heart is burning. Nagumo does not curse. He does not slam his fist. He simply stares at the spreading smoke and says, low enough that only the men closest hear it, that they have been struck at the worst possible moment. It is not a complaint. It is an acknowledgement. Like a doctor naming an illness that has already advanced too far. Messages come in from the other carriers. Kaga is on fire. Soryu is hit. Hiryu is maneuvering, still alive, still fighting. The radio room is a cave of frantic voices and coded phrases. Operators keep their hands steady, because their hands are the only part of the fleet that still has order, somewhere in that chaos. An officer speaks the thought that many are swallowing. The air groups, the trained men, the ones who know how to launch and recover in darkness and spray. The ones who can land on a pitching deck with fuel leaking and an engine coughing. Those men cannot be replaced quickly. Ships can be laid down. Steel can be hammered into shape. But deck crews and carrier pilots are not steel. Kusaka turns his head toward Nagumo, as if asking permission to say it aloud. When he speaks, it is with the flat honesty of a staff officer who has just watched the foundation crack. He says the carriers are not only ships, they are schools, and the schools are burning. Nagumo's eyes track a fire crew pushing into smoke with hoses that spit thin streams. He watches men fight flames that are already past fighting. In his mind, he can see the faces of squadron leaders, the petty officers who guide aircraft into position, the landing signal men who read the wind and the deck like scripture. He says, almost to himself, that the true loss will not be counted in tonnage. Out on the horizon, smoke columns climb from the wounded carriers, marking them like funeral incense against the pale sky. The Japanese fleet has come to finish an enemy, and instead it has been caught with its throat exposed. The moment is so sudden, so complete, that it feels unreal. Yet the burning is real. The screaming is real. The sea is real, waiting to swallow whatever cannot be saved. And as Akagi's deck becomes a furnace, the men who built Japan's carrier striking arm begin to understand something colder than fear. This is not a setback that can be fixed in months. This is the core being broken. The smoke is visible for miles, but the first shock reaches Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto through words, not sight. On Yamato, far to the west with the main body, the air is cleaner, the decks calmer, the routine still intact in that cruel way distance allows. The flagship's bridge is a cathedral of steel and glass. Officers move with practiced restraint, speaking in clipped phrases, saluting, passing message pads along a chain of hands. Outside, the sea is indifferent, rolling in long swells that lift and lower the battleship like a slow breath. A communications officer steps forward, posture rigid, as if the stiffness can hold reality in place. He presents the message. Yamamoto reads it once, then again. His eyes do not widen, his face does not break, but those closest to him see the change anyway. A tightening around the mouth, a stillness that sinks into the bridge like a weight. Akagi heavily damaged by bombs. Kaga heavily damaged. Soryu heavily damaged. Fires uncontrollable. There is a long moment where nobody speaks, because to speak is to admit the scale of it. The carriers are not simply units on a chart. They are the spear point of everything Yamamoto has built since before the war began. He has wagered Japan's future on naval air power, on sudden violence delivered across oceans. The men on those decks, the pilots in those cockpits, they are the sharp edge. Another message follows like a second punch. Hiryu still operational. Counter-strike launched. That gives the bridge something to cling to. A single carrier, still alive, still moving, still able to hurt the enemy. Yamamoto's staff shifts instantly into calculation mode. If Hiryu can cripple American carriers, then the battle can still be rescued. Not won cleanly, perhaps, but rescued. A damaged enemy might retreat. A damaged enemy might give time. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, leans closer to the chart table. His finger traces distances and bearings. He speaks of intercepting, of closing the range, of using battleships to finish what carriers began. The old doctrine, the decisive gun battle, rises from the shadows, ready to be used if the modern spear has snapped. Yamamoto listens, but his mind is already elsewhere, already walking across the burning decks he cannot see. Another signal arrives, the words more jagged, more urgent. American carriers located. Here you strike hit enemy carrier, another enemy carrier engaged. For a brief slice of time, hope flares. Officers allow themselves to breathe. Yamamoto's gaze lifts toward the horizon as if he can pull the fleet forward by sheer will. He orders units to close. He wants contact. He wants the enemy trapped. Then the next message comes. Hiryu attacked. Severe damage. Fires. Now the bridge truly goes quiet. Not the quiet of calm, but the quiet of a room where the air has been sucked out. Yamamoto reads it. He hands it back. The paper feels too small to contain what it means. Ugaki's jaw clenches. Several staff officers glance down, away, as if ashamed to be seen in the moment the impossible becomes certain. The Imperial Navy has just lost, in hours, what it took years to create. 4 first-line carriers, the core of the Kido Butai. The names are not just ships, they are symbols. Akagi, the flagship of Pearl Harbor. Kaga, the Iron Fist. Soryu, Hiryu, the paired dragons. They were the center of gravity. Yamamoto speaks at last, quietly, and his voice makes everyone straighten because it is so controlled it is frightening. He says the battle has turned against them. He says they have suffered serious losses. He does not say the word disaster, but the room hears it anyway. Another officer, voice low, reports that many aircrew are missing, not simply aircraft destroyed, but the men themselves, gone into the sea or trapped in burning hangars. Yamamoto's eyes narrow. This is where the wound becomes permanent. Ships can be built. Steel can be replaced with steel, but carrier air groups are not steel, he asks, in a tone that pretends it is routine. How many pilots have returned? How many are accounted for? His staff cannot answer with certainty. The battle is still unfolding. Reports incomplete. Rescue impossible amid the flames and the threat of submarine and air attack. They can only estimate. The estimates are grim. Ugaki, who keeps a war diary with obsessive discipline, says in a tight voice that this loss will take a long time to mend. The bridge officers do not need him to say it. Every man there understands the arithmetic of training. Years to build an aviator who can land on a moving deck in bad weather, who can navigate over open ocean, who can coordinate and attack in formation, who can stay calm while flak claws at the sky. Years. Yamamoto stares down at the map of the Pacific spread across the chart table like an open wound. Midway, a tiny speck. Hawaii. Far to the east, Japan. Far to the west, between them, an ocean so wide it once seemed like a shield. Now it feels like a trap, because the fleet that was meant to dominate that ocean is burning. He turns slightly toward Ugaki and the others and says something that lands like a stone. He says the loss of these carriers is not merely a blow to the fleet. It is a blow to the war. He does not raise his voice. He does not dramatize. He simply states a fact. Then he gives an order that tastes like ash. The operation is to be broken off. The officers around him respond automatically, acknowledging, repeating, sending signals. The machinery of command keeps moving even when the heart is cold. Out at sea, destroyers and cruisers begin to shift, to screen, to prepare for withdrawal. Submarines prowl. Search planes sweep. But the grand design has collapsed. The decisive battle Yamamoto wanted has instead exposed Japan's most precious asset and shattered it. And in the hours that follow, as the sun lowers and smoke continues to rise from the far horizon, the senior men of the Imperial Navy begin to speak in the private language of professionals facing ruin. They do not speak of honor. They speak of pilots. They speak of deck crews. They speak of time. Because time is the one resource Japan cannot replace. Night falls over the Pacific with a softness that feels wrong. The sky darkens to ink, and the first stars appear above a battlefield that is still burning. Out on the water, the glow of fire flickers against low clouds. It is not a clean darkness. It is a darkness lit by the dying. On the surviving Japanese ships, men stand at rails and stare toward the horizon where their carriers were. Some whisper the names, as if saying them might keep the ships afloat. Others say nothing at all, because there are no words that can make sense of a fleet that went out whole and came back hollow. Aboard Yamato, The bridge lights are dimmed. The ship's great guns sit silent, useless in a battle decided by aircraft. Yamamoto remains on the bridge longer than protocol demands, as if leaving would make the defeat real. His posture is erect, but his eyes are tired now, and the fatigue is not physical. It is the fatigue of a man who has just seen his strategic foundation crack. Ugaki stands nearby, hands behind his back, staring at the chart table. He is thinking in numbers. How many planes gone? How many aircrew gone? How many carriers gone? The total is not just material. The total is experience, skill, confidence, a particular kind of fearlessness that cannot be manufactured. A staff officer approaches with a fresh estimate of losses among the carrier air groups. The figures are incomplete, but they are enough. Yamamoto listens. He asks again, very quietly, about the veteran pilots. How many of the Pearl Harbor leaders? How many of the men from the Indian Ocean raid? How many section leaders? How many landing signal officers? The officer answers in fragments. Many missing, some rescued, many presumed lost. Yamamoto's mouth tightens. He turns his gaze toward the dark sea and says, not to the room, but to the night itself, that the enemy has struck at the heart. Ugaki, in a voice controlled to the edge of breaking, says the same thought more bluntly. He says the loss is not the ships. He says the loss is the men. On another ship, farther east, a cruiser bridge is crowded with exhausted officers who have been awake since before dawn, eyes bloodshot from smoke and strain. They speak in low tones, like doctors discussing a patient who has already died, but whose body is still warm. One says they can build new carriers. Another replies that carriers without trained air groups are floating targets. A third officer, older, his face lined with salt and worry, says it will take years to replace the training, and the war will not give them years. These are not speeches for morale. These are professional assessments, spoken in the brittle hours after disaster when truth slips out because there is no longer any reason to pretend. Meanwhile, out among the destroyers, the work is brutal and immediate. Searchlights sweep the black water. Boats are lowered. Men cling to wreckage. Some are pulled aboard coughing seawater, faces grey with shock. Others are found too late, drifting in silence. The ocean gives back a few. It keeps most. A surviving aviator is hauled over a destroyer's side, his flight suit stiff with salt, his hands trembling so violently he cannot salute. An ensign tries to speak, but only makes a raw sound. A petty officer wraps him in a blanket and says nothing, because there is no comfort to offer. On Yamamoto asks for reports from the ships that can still communicate. He learns that not all is lost in the immediate sense. The fleet still has battleships. It still has cruisers. It still has destroyers. Japan is not defenseless tonight. But the weapon that gave Japan reach is gone. The following morning, June 5th, the sea is calmer, the sky a pale blue that makes the smoke stand out even more sharply. The Japanese fleet continues to withdraw. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the fighting spirit of Hiryu, is gone with his carrier, choosing to stay aboard as the ship burns and sinks. Word of his death spreads through the fleet like a cold wind. Some admire it. Some feel only sorrow. All feel the weight of it. Because men like Yamaguchi are rare, and rare things are being consumed. In a cramped radio room on a cruiser, an officer reads through intercepted American transmissions and realizes with a sick certainty that the enemy carriers survived in greater number than expected. The Americans did not lose their core the way Japan did. The balance, already precarious, has shifted. The admirals begin to talk in private, careful voices. The words are not poetic. They are practical. They say the Americans can replace losses faster. They say American pilot training pipelines are deep. They say American industry is vast, They say Japan has gambled and lost. Yamamoto does not argue. He has always known the industrial truth. He once warned that Japan could run wild for a limited time, but that prolonged war would favor the United States. Now he has watched that theory become reality in one morning of bombs and fire. At a staff meeting, an officer suggests alternative operations, ways to regain initiative, ways to conceal weakness. Yamamoto hears him out. Then he says, with a flatness that ends the discussion, that the carrier force must be rebuilt, but it cannot be rebuilt quickly. The tone is not defeatist, it is final. Ugaki adds, almost as if speaking to himself, that this loss changes everything. The enemy will press. The enemy will not wait. The enemy now knows Japan can bleed. Elsewhere, on a transport or a small auxiliary vessel, a rescued deck crewman from Kaga sits with his head in his hands. He keeps repeating the same phrase, a fragment of reality stuck in his mind. He says they were rearming when the bombs came. They were full of fuel, full of bombs. He says it was like the ship exploded from inside. That detail, passed from mouth to mouth, becomes the explanation the fleet accepts. Not an excuse, not a comfort, but an explanation. A few minutes difference, a different order, a different search pattern. The carriers might have launched, might have lived, but might does not matter now. The Japanese leadership, from Yamamoto down to the junior officers, understands the truth that will haunt every plan from this day forward. Midway was not simply a battle. It was the moment Japan's experienced naval air power was severed. The core fleet, the trained heart, the skilled hands that made carrier war possible, has been destroyed or scattered into the sea. And as the fleet withdraws westward, leaving the smoke behind, the admirals say what professionals say when the situation is beyond courage. They say the war will outlast the training. They say the war will not wait. They say Japan has lost something it cannot replace in time. June 6th, 1942, Tokyo. The Naval General Staff Building sits in the humid early summer air, its corridors smelling faintly of ink, sweat, and cigarette smoke. The city moves as if nothing has happened, streetcars rattling, clerks hurrying, shop shutters lifting. But behind closed doors, time is tightening like a wire. A duty officer carries a folder through a hallway where men speak softly and avoid each other's eyes. The folder is stamped and resealed and stamped again, as if layers of paper can soften the impact. In a conference room, senior officers gather around a long table. The mood is not loud. There is no theatrical outrage. It is the quiet of professionals reading a diagnosis they already feared. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, listens as the report is read. He does not interrupt. His hands rest on the table, fingers still. Around him sit men who have spent their adult lives believing in the fleet as Japan's shield and sword. They have argued doctrine, pushed budgets, fought for aircraft production, for pilot intake, for fuel allocations. Now they must interpret loss on a scale that threatens the whole structure. The reader reaches the key lines. 4 carriers lost. Many aircrew missing. Operation halted. For a moment, the only sound is paper settling back onto the table. Nagano speaks first. Not with panic, but with a slow precision. He asks for numbers. Not the ship names. Those are already burned into everyone's mind. He asks for air group strength. He asks how many pilots were recovered, how many deck crew specialists, how many ordnance men, how many landing signal officers. A staff officer answers with what he has, and what he has is incomplete. The estimates shift from mouth to mouth, but the direction never changes. Too many. Another admiral, older, voice tight, says they can accelerate shipbuilding. He says new hulls are already being prepared and more can be laid down. He talks about steel and engines and yard schedules because those are things he can control. Nagano lets him finish. Then Nagano says the thought that hangs over the room like smoke. He says new ships will not matter if there are no seasoned air groups to put on them. The phrase lands hard because it is not ideology. It is arithmetic. Carrier warfare is not just about owning carriers. It is about the living system aboard them, and that system has been gutted in a single morning. Another officer, perhaps trying to offer something firm, says pilot training can be expanded. More classes, shorter courses. More flight hours cut from the syllabus to push men through faster. The words sound practical, but the room hears the desperation inside them. A blunt admiral responds, not cruelly but honestly. He says shortening training produces pilots who can fly, but not pilots who can fight. Not pilots who can navigate over featureless sea in bad weather. Not pilots who can coordinate an attack through flak and chaos. Not pilots who can land on a moving deck at dusk with fuel fumes in their cockpit. He says experience is the true weapon. The room shifts, chairs creaking. One man rubs his forehead as if trying to erase a mental image. Nagano looks down at the table and says that the Midway losses cannot be hidden from the enemy. The Americans will sense weakness. They will push. They will not give Japan the breathing space that training requires. Someone mentions the name Yamamoto, still at sea, still commanding the combined fleet. There is a pause, because Yamamoto is both respected and controversial, the architect of bold moves and dangerous gambles. An officer says the operation was ambitious. Another says ambition is not the problem. Surprise is, timing is, luck is. But they all understand this is not a debate that matters now. The carriers are already on the ocean floor. In the days that follow, cables and reports move between Tokyo and fleet headquarters. The language is careful, but the meaning is brutal. The Navy must rebuild. The Navy must regain initiative. The Navy must protect the perimeter. The Navy must prepare for the next American move. Yet every plan circles back to the same wound. The admirals begin to speak about the war in a different way. Not as a sequence of victories to be collected, but as a contest of endurance and replacement. They talk about fuel reserves. They talk about aircraft production. They talk about the pilot pipeline as if it is a blood supply that has been severed. They talk about the veteran cadre, the men who cannot be replaced in a year, or two, or perhaps ever. And in private, away from the formal minutes, a harsher sentence is whispered. It passes through offices and mess rooms in fragments, never officially recorded, because it is too sharp to be useful for morale. It is the idea that Japan has spent its best carrier airmen. Not all, but enough that the edge is dulled. Some officers insist that spirit can overcome disparity. They say the Navy has always done more with less. They say Japan will adapt. They say the Americans will pay for every mile. Others, quieter, say spirit cannot land a plane on a black deck at night. They say spirit cannot replace the hands that knew every bolt and cable of a carrier deck. They say spirit cannot create time, because Midway did not just remove ships. It removed a generation of specialists. And as Tokyo's admirals stare at maps and production figures and training schedules, they begin to understand the shape of the future. The next battles will not be decided by how many carriers Japan had on paper. They will be decided by who can keep trained men in the air, month after month, when the war turns into grinding attrition. July 1942. Truck Lagoon. The anchorage is bright and deceptively peaceful, a ring of green islands around water so clear it looks harmless. Yet the ships at anchor carry the smell of scorched paint and tired men. Messages arrive daily, folded and stamped, and every message feels like it weighs more than paper should. Aboard the carriers that survived Midway, the flight decks are busy again, but the rhythm is different. The hands are not as quick, the signals are not as crisp. In the ready rooms, there are seats that stay empty. A pilot walks in, pauses without meaning to, and his eyes go to the corner where a friend used to sit. He does not speak the name. He only sits down and stares at the briefing board. Senior officers notice, not as sentiment, but as performance. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa visits a carrier and watches a recovery cycle. The aircraft come in steady, but the spacing is wider than it used to be. The landing signal officer moves his paddles with confidence, yet you can see the strain in the way his shoulders hold tight. When the last plane traps and the prop wash dies down, Ozawa turns to a staff officer and asks a simple question. How many of these men have done this under fire? The answer is short, not enough. In meetings that follow, admirals choose their words carefully. They do not call the new pilots bad. They call them green. They call them unseasoned. They call them brave but untested. The distinction matters because bravery is plentiful. Experience is rare. A staff officer lays out training figures. Intake increased. Hours cut to move men through. More instructors working longer days. On paper, the numbers look hopeful. An admiral listens and then says, quietly, "That paper does not teach a man how to find his carrier in bad weather after a long strike." Another adds that paper does not teach a man how to hold formation when anti-aircraft fire turns the sky into a wall. A third says, the worst truth of Midway is that Japan did not just lose carriers. Japan lost teachers. That sentence hangs in the room because everyone understands it. The veteran pilots were not only fighters, they were the men who showed others how to fight. They were the landing specialists, the section leaders, the navigators who could smell a storm before it arrived. They were the ones who made the difficult look routine. In August, the war moves south into a different kind of hell. Guadalcanal. The name is new to most Japanese sailors when the first reports come in, but it becomes familiar in days. An airfield, Marines, American carriers nearby. The perimeter is being tested, and Japan cannot ignore it. Orders go out. Ships raise steam. Planes are shifted forward. The Navy that just suffered a core wound is told to fight again immediately. At Rabaul, the air is heavy with tropical heat and engine exhaust. Pilots sweat through their flight suits before they even climb into the cockpit. Maintenance crews work with sleeves rolled up, hands black with oil, trying to keep aircraft flying in conditions that eat metal. Commanders speak in confident tones for the benefit of younger men, but their eyes look older than their faces. A newly assigned pilot sits with a cup of watery tea and listens to veterans talk about Midway. Not as myth, not as glory, but as a lesson written in fire. One veteran tells him the Americans will not miss the second chance. Another says the enemy has learned how to hunt carriers. When the new pilot asks what to do, the veteran answers with a bitter sort of kindness. He says, "Survive long enough to become experienced." That is the new standard. As the Solomons campaign grows, the Japanese admirals begin to speak with a colder realism. After each air battle, reports are tallied and compared, not just aircraft lost. Pilots lost, crew chiefs lost, the men who can repair battle damage quickly, the men who can improvise when parts are missing, the men who know the small tricks that keep a squadron alive. In a planning session, an admiral points to a map and says the fleet can still strike hard, but it cannot strike often. Another says their strength now lies in choosing the moment, because they cannot afford waste. Someone suggests aggressive attacks to regain initiative. The room is silent for a second. Then a senior officer says, in a tone that ends argument, that courage is not the problem. The problem is replacement. He says the enemy can lose a squadron and generate another. Japan loses a squadron and loses the memory of how that squadron fought. Outside the conference room, you can hear aircraft engines warming up, the rising whine and the shudder through the deck plates. On the flight line, a young pilot straps in and smiles too brightly. A petty officer checks his harness twice, because the petty officer has seen what happens when small errors meet combat. And far above the sea, when the formations climb and turn toward the horizon, there is a feeling you can almost taste in the air. Determination, yes, pride. yes, but also a thin edge of fear that the admirals do not say aloud. The fear that the Corps is still missing. The fear that every loss now is not just a loss. It is a step toward a future where Japan has carriers again, but not the men who once made them deadly. October 1944. Philippine Sea, east of Luzon. The dawn is gray and bruised, the kind of morning where the horizon looks close enough to touch. On a Japanese flagship, the air smells of stale coffee and wet canvas. Men speak in low voices, because they have learned that loud confidence does not stop bombs. The war has stretched longer than anyone in that Tokyo conference room wanted to admit in 1942. The carriers lost at Midway were supposed to be replaced. New hulls were laid down. Names were assigned. Flight decks were built, but the core that mattered was never truly replaced. Now, as the Japanese fleet prepares for a last great gamble, senior officers look at their air groups and see the ghost of Midway staring back. Not in the number of planes, but in the faces. Too young, too few hours, too little time on deck, too little time in combat. In a wardroom, a senior carrier officer speaks to his staff. He does not call it hopeless. He calls it difficult. The language of professionals again. Careful, controlled. He says their pilots will do their duty. He says their pilots have spirit. He says they will strike the enemy where it hurts. Then, when the room empties and only a few remain, his voice drops. He says the truth that has been growing for 2 years. He says the experienced cadre was burned away at Midway and consumed again in the Solomons. He says Japan now fights with training schedules, not veterans. In another compartment, an admiral studies a roster of air crew. He reads names, ages, flight hours. The numbers are wrong in a way that cannot be fixed by will. He remembers the men of 1941 and early 1942, the pilots who could coordinate an attack with a glance, who could fly long range over ocean and return on fumes, who could land a damaged aircraft on a carrier deck pitching in heavy seas. He remembers how they sounded on the radio, calm, efficient, certain. He looks at the new rosters and feels the gap like a missing limb. On deck, the younger pilots walk with a stiffness that mimics confidence. Some of them are brave beyond words. That is not in question. But bravery is not the same as mastery. A deck crewman watches them and thinks of the men who used to teach these routines, the men who used to correct mistakes with a sharp word and a slap on the shoulder. Those teachers are mostly gone. Out on the sea, the American carrier task forces move with a confidence built from thousands of sorties. Their decks are factories of flight. Their pilot training pipeline is deep and constant. Their replacement system is mature. The Japanese admirals can feel it even before the first engagement. The enemy is not just stronger, the enemy is steadier as the operation begins. Messages move between ships, bearings, contacts, fuel states, and threaded through it all is a quiet awareness that Japan is attempting something very close to a final throw of the dice. A staff officer asks, in the careful manner of a subordinate who does not want to offend, whether the air groups can execute the required strikes. The admiral answers that they must. Then he pauses and adds, almost like a confession. He says, if this were 1942, he would not doubt it. That single sentence contains everything Midway did. When the first strikes launch, the flight decks roar with engines and prop wash. Planes roll forward and lift, one after another, into the gray sky. The sight is stirring. The old spectacle of naval air power. The Empire's winged fist. But as the formations climb, small errors appear. Spacing, navigation, timing. Things the old air groups made clean, the new groups make ragged. It is not because they do not want it enough. It is because they do not have the muscle memory of hundreds of deck landings and the brutal tuition of combat. When losses come, they come fast, because this is now a war of radar, fighters, coordinated anti-aircraft fire, and relentless pursuit. A young pilot who survives his first pass comes back shaking so hard he can barely read his instruments. He has done his best, and it was not enough. In the Admiral's cabin later, after reports arrive, the words become even colder. Not angry, not dramatic, just cold. He says they are paying for lost experience. He says the war has become a contest of replacement and Japan cannot keep up. He says Midway was the moment the balance started to tilt, because it destroyed the core of Japan's experienced naval air power. And he says the line that many Japanese leaders understood in 1942 but could not admit openly. He says rebuilding trained pilots and deck crews takes years, and the war did not allow years. Outside, the sea keeps rolling, the sky keeps changing color. The battle continues because fleets do not stop fighting just because the outcome is grim. But in the voices of Japan's senior naval men, in their private assessments and their clipped professional sentences, you can hear the long echo of that morning near Midway. The carriers were steel. The air groups were blood. Midway spilled the blood. And everything after. Every desperate operation, every brave launch, every sacrifice. Was Japan trying to fight on while the wound never truly healed?